Hey, it's been a little bit of time since we've uploaded a new episode of the podcast, but we're here in April and going to get things going. Our guest today is Pedro Gonzalez. He's a columnist and commentator, originally from San Diego, but now living in Ohio. I would say he's a right of center uh, writer, but someone who's very independent minded. I followed his writing, read his stuff, and watched him on Fox News and other outlets for many years. I think this is the first time we've talked, except for a few DMs over the years. Um, but you can find his writing, his previous writing at the American Conservative, at Newsweek, at Chronicles, many other publications. He has a great Substack. I'm a subscriber. It's readcontra.com. I subscribe. I highly recommend you do as well. Pedro, how's it going?
It's going well, Lee. Thanks so much for having me. It's good to actually talk to you.
Yeah, good to see you.
As opposed to DM with you.
Yeah, you look very shadowy there. I appreciate the kind of aesthetic, the dark layer.
Yeah.
But I want to just kind of introduce you a little bit to our readers, our listeners, our small audience here. Tell me about your background. How'd you get into writing, politics? What was your path?
It's like asking, what's your life story? No, yeah. It kind of was. I mean, I had a really unusual path into commentary. Like I was always like writing was a hobby for me. And before I started to write about politics, I wrote about personal things. Like it was a way for me to process stuff, like not to immediately get into, the guts of it, but like, writing was how I processed things that were happening around me, and in particular, like family life. Like I had a half sister who I was really close with as a kid, and it's funny. This also actually, I was reflecting on this recently, that how much it affected my political views. I had a half sister who, her life was ruined by addiction, and I just remember how we were so close when I was really little. And I looked up to her, and then just our paths sort of diverging and watching what it did to her and our family. And years later, the way that I processed that stuff was just by writing about it. And so it was just something that I was always doing. I never actually thought I would put it to use certainly not as like a political commentator. And I was kind of like I don't have, like I said, a very like orthodox background for someone who does what I do now. I was kind of oh man, Lee, you're bringing it all to the surface. No, I wanted to join the military. Like my whole like life goal for basically from high school until like getting into my 30s was to join the military. And this, I swear, this is relevant. This is not me just like dumping, on you. I wanted to be in the military. I specifically wanted to be in special operations, but I was born with a benign medical condition that is a permanent disqualification for pretty much all the armed services. And I spent years trying to get in with the Marines and then with the Navy. I got like, I think I reached out to like the office of Congressman Duncan Hunter before like the whole scandal happened with him, and like asked him to write me a letter. I had like members of like the Naval Special Warfare community who were mentoring me. And I was part of a program that was designed to groom people for careers in SWIC, which is like the boat guys, and for SEALs. Basically, the goal was to reduce the attrition levels for candidates, because the average like SF guy costs a lot of money to train, and so in order to reduce waste, the Navy and other branches implement these mentorship programs that basically just physically and mentally prepare you for passing selection. And I was part of one. Ironically, I think it was actually it had a diversity angle to it. I think part of its mission was to get more people of color into the Navy. It's kind of funny, but most of the guys I trained with were white. That's why I think it didn't occur to me that it was like that it had that component to it, because the majority of the guys who were in my group were white guys from California, and I did that for years. It was like the only thing I wanted to do. And I grew up on like movies like Vision Quest, and so I was just like, this is the thing that I want to do. And like, this is it. And I can't like give up on it. And, but that all came to a halt after I got like 3 letters of recommendation from a deputy commander for JSOT and like active and former members of the SF community or the Naval Special Warfare community, and it was like a full court push to just get me a waiver, like not even like like a guaranteed spot or whatever, but just like give them a chance, basically give them a chance to fail. And the Navy said no. And I remember like I got taken to the base in Coronado, and I got sat down with a doctor, and not a doctor, it was some kind of a commander. And he basically just said like, look, kid, I know that this has like been the only thing that you've ever wanted to do, but you can't. And then the guy that took me to that meeting was also like, at the time he was in charge of he just got back from a deployment in the Philippines, and he kind of became like a dad. But anyways, like that was basically what I did for like pretty much all my 20s. And in the background, like in order to like support myself, I was actually just doing a bunch of like fitness involved stuff. Like I was a CrossFit coach at one point. I was working at a gym teaching like boxing, like basic like fundamentals, and like doing Muay Thai and things like that. And I was my life was entirely like physical, and writing was just like a hobby. Like I said, it was something I did in the background. But then like 26, 27, I'm like, oh man, I'm getting old, and the thing I wanted to do is not going to happen. So I got to figure something else out. So then I started going back to I got into community college in San Diego, and became an English major. And then I needed to transfer, and I switched to political science, and then I joined a political science program in Ohio, and that's how I ended up here. And basically, in college, I was exposed. I went through like the basic, conversion of like, oh man, these professors suck because they won't let me read Mark Twain in peace, and kind of doing like the basic, pipeline college Republican thing, except I was older. I was 26, 27. And then, yeah, I mean, that got me writing about politics, and politically, I'm sorry, you can stop me.
No, keep going.
Okay.
I think it's interesting.
Politically, gosh, it was a weird mix of like my parents being like Hispanic Catholics, basically. There was always a kind of like social conservatism to it. So, but also, that butts up against like the ambient liberalism of California, but it's not like the insane liberalism, like the insane leftism of, that everyone associates with like the left today. It was, I don't know how to describe it. It was just kind of like I don't know. It was California. And the main thing is like, I realize this only now of like how lucky I was to grow up in California, like in the 90s and like early 2000s, because it was still like, it was before everything I think truly went insane, or at least I didn't notice it growing up, and it was like idyllic for me.
I mean, I think most people have this stereotype of California because the most vocal progressives are the craziest ones, just like the most vocal people in politics are the craziest ones wherever you are on the spectrum. But most Californians are just normies, just like most people everywhere, and they're just liberals. They're just normal liberals which basically means they spend 99% of their time thinking about things that are not political. And then the 1% of the time that they think of things political, they're like, oh yeah, well, I support a woman's right to choose. And, I'm against, I think we should cut the defense budget or what, just like very normal liberal opinions. And people get that wrong about California, that it's just like everywhere else, bunch of liberal normies.
Yeah,
and then a few loud mouths.
It was liberal, normie liberalism, I guess is the best way I can describe it. And politically, like before that, I was not super interested in politics. Like the stuff I was writing about, like I said, it was personal. It was like creative stuff that will never see the light of day. But I remember liking like what Bernie Sanders was saying about like Wall Street and immigration and things like that. And it made it really easy to make the shift from like hey, I like the way that this guy's talking about basically like the little guy getting screwed over, and immigration, open borders being like a Koch brothers scheme, to supporting like Donald Trump in 2015 and like hating Hillary Clinton. And but in that also 2015 is getting into the part where I'm like realizing the only thing that I've ever wanted to do in my life is not going to work out, and I have to come up with a plan. 2015, 2016 is when the door is like starting. I can see the door shutting, and I'm just trying to figure things out. So yeah, I mean, there's more. That's kind of like a brief summary, and like I said, it's not like typical. In college or in high school, I was like a college Republican and like railing against the liberals or something like that. And then in college, I like start my own like TPUSA. Like it wasn't not like that at all. It was a very different journey that brought me to where I am now.
You were also very influenced by like internet culture, right? Like you were
Yeah,
online. That kind of connection. Like if you look at the data about uh, the type of voter in the Midwest, and you ended up in the Midwest, but the crucial Midwest voter who voted for Obama twice and then Trump, that's what basically cost Hillary Clinton the election. These were not necessarily super online people. It was more like blue collar Democrats, people who were concerned about foreign entanglement abroad, about NAFTA and free trade, and the TPP trade deal. These are folks that didn't like the political establishment, that really just wanted a change agent, and they saw that in Bernie, saw that in Obama, they saw that in Trump. Um, but you're something different. You're someone who would, you saw an appeal in the military, um, saw your kind of dreams deferred there, and Um, I think correct me if I'm wrong, but you kind of gravitated to the kind of online milieu that was just populist, that was angry at the at the establishment, didn't like the liberal cultural order or the kind of right left uniparty on big kind of corporate issues. Could you describe a little bit, like, is that a correct, like, you had like
yeah,
there was a kind
yeah,
of prototypical Bernie to Trump voter.
yeah,
You had part of that path, but maybe a different way of
yeah,
reaching it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. And I think the appeal of populism, and in particular Trumpian populism, is precisely that it for people like me who are like never, obviously it's a much broader spectrum than that, but for my type, which is like always viewing politicians and political systems with like skepticism, it makes that's, I mean, that's the power of populism, and that's part of like the Trump myth, right? Is that he's on the side of the little guy, and he's the only one that's like not bought, not compromised. And it makes, I mean, and Bernie had his own element of that that he was the only guy that like the Democratic Party would shaft because he was the only one who was telling the truth about the powers that be. Like, and that again, that's why it made it so easy for people to make that shift. And in my case, it was a combination of the skepticism for the incumbent political order, and also I think the militant aspect of Trumpian populism. Because again, like I was coming from a background, it's physical, and basically you look at politics as combat, and almost as a zero sum game. And in some ways, I think that might be inescapable. I think you can have a debate about that. That there, it just, I mean, politics are always going to be that way. But it made the allure of Trumpism as like combat against a regime, against a corrupt political order, very appealing and easy for someone like me to get into. And I was thinking about this thing because it's hard to figure out like when I started to interact with like the online right, I guess you could call it. And the earliest, I think, influence on me was actually a good friend he was a Marine, he was a combat veteran. He went to an Ivy League school, and I think he got out of the Marines. He was in recon, and then he went to like an Ivy, and he kind of like radicalized at an Ivy. I guess I use that term like very loosely. Like he became basically, you know, like very right wing at an Ivy, and he was the one that I would kind of get in debates too, because again, like I like normie California
Rob
liberalism.
Henderson?
What's that?
I said, was it Rob Henderson? That
Oh,
sounds like
no,
his
no,
life
no.
story.
No. I don't want to. I won't give any more details. But he's a really good guy, and it's funny because I think he kind of also like in the end like mellowed out and basically just focused on starting a family. But we would get into like arguments about stuff, and he would kind of point me in the direction of like, well, you should go, you know, check out this thread or like this forum or something like that. And that was like the beginning of like my interaction with like the online right, basically. And through this guy who had like a life, basically he was like living the life that I wanted to live. And he was older than I was. And so I really looked up to him, and I still, we've lost touch, but I still think he's a great guy. And, but that was it. Like, and the thing that stuck out to me, and this sounds like so typical now, was that he was never, even when we disagreed on stuff, like he was never vicious. It's funny because this is completely changed, but you know, basically I thought of him as like my fringe right friend. But he was never like, when we disagreed on stuff, like it was never like, we can't be friends anymore. Mm-hmm. You know, like, well, of course you disagree, you're brown or something like that. Like it was just like, it was agree to disagree, you know, read this, and you know, like links to like VDare and things like that, you know, but the thing that struck me is that he, like, again, it was always like civil, and this has obviously changed a lot. Like, I think like there's a quality to the online right today that is very much like everything is Thunderdome basically. And there are no disagreements. There are only like enemies and enmity.
Can I ask you, since yeah. I think it's fair to say that you're disillusioned with a right these days, and you just wrote a post called "The Scylla and the Charybdis" about not joining these mobs, whether they're on the left or the right. Yeah. At one point, when you were full MAGA, did you think of yourself as a movement conservative, and like this was your tribe, this was your people, you felt spiritually and socially at home among them, or was it more instrumental than that?
I never thought of myself, I don't think I ever thought of myself as like a movement conservative, because like it was kind of like getting dropped. And to be clear, like a lot of my views, almost all of them, you could still characterize as like, well, you know, it's like you're saying you're against that you don't feel like you're part of the new right or the online right, but all of your views, most of your views seem to align with them. And that's true, but there's this other aspect to it. And it's like, I think I touched on it in that piece, this kind of mob aspect that it's so frustrating for me, because they'll kind of draw these red lines and say, basically, anyone who says this thing or supports this position is just intolerable and needs to be just completely jettisoned from the movement. But then, you know, if Donald Trump does it, or someone who has basically proven to be loyal to Donald Trump does it or says it, they get a pass. And there's this like violent inconsistency in the movement that results in actually like a lot of bad outcomes and contradictions. And ultimately it boils down to just this kind of mob mentality that actually the things that you say, the words don't actually matter. And it becomes just sort of like, it's so overused, but it is just a cult of personality. And maybe those are just inevitable. And to some degree, I think a lot of politics boil down to personality cults, especially around figures like, you know, FDR, Roosevelt, whatever. So there's an inevitable quality to that. But going back to your question, I thought of myself as part of it. And it's funny, like I'll go back and like see old tweets where I'm going after someone, because I was known as like a polemicist, and I still do that from time to time, but my targets are different. But I read like these old tweets where I'm like, you know, making fun of like Adam Kinzinger, who I think still probably deserves it. But like the things that I'm saying, I'm like, wow, like, man, that was pretty brutal. Like I would probably do it differently today. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you think of yourself as basically participating in it. And again, you're not engaging in politics so much as you are like going to war against an opponent. And it's always personal. always deeply personal, and it's again, I think that the probably the best term is enmity, I think, which is this kind of like totalizing totalizing hatred of someone, where you basically abstract the individual and no longer think of them as a person as such, but like as an idea, as part of an idea to be crushed and defeated and like relegated to the dustbin of history.
Yeah, I don't want to use terms that immediately turn off people's brains, and people are like, "Oh, these, whoa, okay, too much." But there is a quality that reminds me of elements of both fascism and communism, where both movements really needed to create kind of an internal coherency. They had to create enemies to be destroyed and to define themselves about it in the destruction of a class enemy or a race enemy or a minority group. And that's taken a little bit far. I wouldn't apply it to our today's politics precisely that way. But in the Venn diagram, there's a little bit shared there, where we see movements on the left and right that start losing any intellectual consistency.
Yes.
I
The
would
only
go.
consistency is destruction of the common enemy.
I would actually be less hesitant about applying that analogy, because I do think that, not fascism and communism as they were historically reflected, but just in terms of like extremists on the left and the right. I've thought more and more in recent years about like the cheerleaders on the right and the cheerleaders on the left are going after each other's throats on Twitter and other social media platforms and on cable news, have more to do with each other than they have to do with the rest of us. Like, they're like, this is speaking, Pedro, to your latest post, I think, in that spirit, that they're like, they have they obviously have a what's the word, the symbiotic relationship with each other, where they each need each other to subsist and to advance in their careers, and they're speaking to each other, and they're in the same game together. It's like, two two NFL teams playing against each other have more in common with each other than they do with the people in the stands. And like, that's how I see politics now. It's just like, you can join whichever team you want to. You can flip from right to left if you want to. You're going to be doing more or less the same thing. And it doesn't have anything to do with the lives of regular people anymore. Which is, to bring it to your analogy, which was kind of, I think, the situation in Weimar Germany, actually, with where there were the big, not to be too cute about this analogy, but with, mobs of Nazis and mobs of revolutionary communists marching in the street and having street battles with each other, and regular German families. Obviously, we know how that turned out, but at first, had nothing to do with either of them. It wanted nothing to do with either of them.
It's funny. I was not expecting to have this discussion at all today. That's why I apologize if it sounds like I'm like stammering and it's taking me like a while to summon the things that I want to say, because I wasn't expecting to talk about this or get so deep into it. But part of the challenge for me talking about any of this stuff is that, again, like if you asked me to tell you what I think about certain things, you'd probably come to the conclusion that, like, wait, you sound a lot like the people that you're now against. And then the other aspect of this is, like, I think it's part of the reason that people who are frustrated with Trumpism, I think, continue to find themselves unable to do anything about it or like counter it, is that they seem to look at it in a vacuum, as if basically Trump just emerged from the ether and everyone just lost their minds, and there are no legitimate grievances behind any of the things that his supporters, that what is behind him is nothing but just cult. That's it. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not like he was actually able to, and like, this is Trump's strength. Like, Trump is like a human funhouse of mirrors. People look at him and they see they just see different things. And that's why you'll have like constitutionalists and, people who look at him as like saving the Constitution, and then people who look at him as like finally killing it off and giving us, Caesar crossing the Rubicon. They will look at the guy and see the same thing. That's why you'll get like people that are just hardcore militant ethno-nationalists. Like, if I had it my way, I would deport every person who's like, there's a funny line from Ben Franklin. He's talking about Germans, and he doesn't like them. He considers them too swarthy, you know. So like basically everyone who's like tan deported, that same person will have the same devotion to Donald Trump as the person who sees him as like the ultimate like anti-racist politician who, you know, has done more for like black people than any other president since like Abraham Lincoln. And you'll get people that like hate transhumanism, and just like they see it everywhere, supporting Trump as fervently as like, you know, the tech people who are like openly, like Elon Musk said today, that as I've been saying for years, the human mind is like the bootloader for digital intel. Basically saying the purpose of the human mind and soul is to kind of just prepare the system for control by the operating system. Like we're like our job is to just imbue AI with the powers to rule us. And he supports Donald Trump. And the funny thing is you never these ideologies never actually seem to have to reconcile all these tensions, because they're mostly defined in opposition to something else. But even that doesn't make sense, because the something else is often something that they end up supporting either directly or indirectly, because of their support for Donald Trump. And he'll just make people swallow things that they swear to God they would never support. You know, whether it's him talking about the Project Stargate or whatever, building a supercomputer with help from the guy who said that if we're all being monitored by AI, we'll be on our best behavior. It's just it really, if you try to make sense of it, like, you go crazy. And so it gets back to this. It sounds like such a simplistic explanation, but it's just mob mentality. But anyways, sorry. The point that I wanted to make was, I think that's at the heart of the failure of people to oppose Donald Trump, is that they just don't understand like why he was able to rise to power. They don't understand the grievances that propelled them to power, or they basically just dismiss them. It's basically like, well, I don't know. I think that Jonah Goldberg was a good example of this, basically saying that everyone who has a problem with like free trade and its consequences is just like stupid. And, their problem is that they never were able to adapt, as if like this was a sort of like the American people all in one voice supported sending jobs and factories overseas and destroying like the heartland. And if you don't like it, it's because you probably suck and can't compete. And it's funny because you're saying the same thing with like AI. I'm noticing that a lot too, with how people talk about AI, and that attitude is a huge part of Trump's staying power and popularity, because it's like his enemies just don't understand him, or they refuse to understand him. And yeah, I mean, it allows all these disparate groups that under different conditions would never be able to like even live with each other. They all coalesce around him, and it is what makes him the phenomenon that he is today.
It feels like to me that Trump has harnessed so much legitimate anger that the elites have ignored, and no matter what policy area or topic the left or Democrats might seize onto to try to counter him, liberals have lost the mandate of heaven over the last 10 years. Like, it's just the kind of accumulated failures around inequality and frustrations around kind of wokeism and public safety. And it all kind of compound to this thing where, yeah, you've got these disparate or even contradictory coalition members that are behind Trump that, rationally speaking, they don't make sense. If they actually had to work out their differences, they would just erupt. There's really no way to reconcile a lot of the differences you just laid out. Yet the failures of the left are so manifest that it kind of just doesn't matter. I don't know.
Yes.
Just to kind of drill down on a more specific point, there was this big blow up around H-1Bs. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Pedro, you've written so much about this. I wrote about it a little bit recently, and just by Googling the topic, I keep seeing your writing. I mean, there's kind of this dichotomy, I think, around you and a lot of other folks that I admire online who maybe you're a little bit more of a bomb thrower or a warrior on social media, but if you read your long form reporting and your journalism, it's extremely thoughtful, extremely rigorous, not bomb throwy. It's well backed up by sources, and you've kind of documented this kind of lurch we've had of this program, this H-1B program that was created to fill this technical need, but just rapaciously exploited by major corporations to bring in low-paid workers to replace, a number of fields, especially IT, and it's exploited from medium-sized businesses in the East Bay to Facebook to Disney, and Donald Trump made this a key point in his campaign in 2016. He did very little to fix it in office in this first term, and then at the outset of his second term, when people in his base and the new online right were demanding a change, here's something that would make sense to make do with his promises to make, with such an immigration and American labor focused presidential campaign. The second his billionaire cohort says, no, this is off the table. We want cheap workers. When Elon Musk says it, then Trump says, look, it's no longer an issue. And then they belittle their base for even caring about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, where are the, yeah. This was an animating feature of Trumpism, and it's just gone because the billionaires don't want it.
Yeah. And this is like, this is what drives me crazy about the right. That there was this whole, if you missed it, for those of you that are watching and listening, there was this whole dust up around H-1Bs. It also happened around the same time that Vivek Ramaswamy made that terrible, like, self-inflicted gunshot wound where he was like, the problem with Americans is that they like revere the nerd. I think he used like Saved by the Bell as an example, that they revere the nerd or the jock instead of the nerd.
Right.
And it was so bad. And that was around the same time that the H-1B thing happened. And so, like, for one element of the right, it's an economic issue, but there's also the element of obviously immigration. So there was a lot of, basically, we don't want our country flooded with Indians, and that kind of like online right stuff, right? Like, I don't want specifically to be replaced by Indians and blah, blah, blah. And then, Elon is saying that the right has, these are like, he's talking about Trump's staunchest supporters. He says that unrepentant racists need to be driven out of the GOP. And it's like, he's talking about like Donald Trump's strongest soldiers online. And then Trump like repeatedly signals that he agrees with Elon. Like he shares articles to that effect. Like, I think he like copy or not copy. He retruths like screenshots of Elon. This is before Trump was like fully back on Twitter. And it's just very clear that Trump is like siding with Elon, as Elon is calling people like retards and racists and stuff like that, like his supporters, and saying that like, we're basically, my faction's going to beat your faction. And so that ends. And the cope for the right was to just sort of continue like doing the "we hate India" bit, like that the only people who support this are like liberals and, brown people. And like today, like, I mean, if you open Twitter, you'll probably see the tweets that I'm talking about. Like, that we had one wish, what would it be? To nuke India. But it's like the reason it's like, obviously for them, it's hilarious. But the reason that I find it insufferable is like, Elon basically just made you like, he just humiliated you. He just told you like, I don't care what you think. I have the president's ear for now. Like that I think we'll talk about this. That might be coming to an end, because I think Elon is becoming starting to become a kind of like liability for Trump. But it's like they console themselves with like the memes and like the racist jokes and stuff like that, because I think deep down they know that they don't actually have a whole lot of control over what's happening. And that sounds insane to say, because, from people that like really follow these scenes, they'll tell you that it's like the 4chan government, which is to say that like there's a pipeline from like online spaces into like the actual federal government. And like literally you probably have like anons that are working there, but still there's this like disconnect between what they're saying and what Donald Trump is doing. And it seems like there's an awareness of that in the administration, that like we have to play to these people.